You hear her before you see her. A faint whimper, barely louder than the creak of old wood shifting under weight. The walls are rough-hewn pine, darkened with time, sealed tight against the night wind that moans outside like some restless spirit. The torchlight flickers across animal pelts nailed to the beams, casting shadows that dance in ways no human ever should. The girl kneels at the center of it all, no older than 16. Her dress, if it can be called that, hangs torn at the shoulder. Her wrists tremble in her lap, her eyes swollen with hours of silent weeping. Her hair is tangled, matted with pine resin and salt. She flinches when a heavy bootstep echoes behind her. Then another. And another. Outside, the drumming begins. Low. Steady. Like a heartbeat rising from beneath the earth. Men chant in unison. The sound isn't joyful. It isn't mournful. It's hungry. You can't move. You are standing just behind the door. You feel the heat of the fire pit. You feel the fear in her chest as if it's your own. The smoke burns your nostrils. You're breathing with her now, short, rapid, uneven. You want to run. But there is nowhere to go. One man enters first. His face is painted with black streaks. He avoids her gaze. He looks ashamed, no, not ashamed. Distant. As if his soul has stepped outside his body to wait until this is over. He unlaces his tunic. Another follows. Then another. She doesn't scream. Not anymore. Because this is not punishment. Not to them. This is ritual. To ensure the spirit of their fallen chieftain finds favor in the next world, the girl must be joined to him. Not in death, not yet, but in the most sacred, most twisted way their gods demand. Outside, the chants grow louder. Inside, the girl becomes less and less a person. She is a vessel. A bridge. An offering. And when the priestess comes, cloaked in furs, face veiled in elk hide, bearing a curved blade carved with runes, there is no protest. No fight. The girl lies back on the reindeer hide, her mouth open to the ceiling, her eyes empty. And the tribe sings louder still. What you're witnessing is not the scene of a nightmare. Not a myth. Not medieval fiction. What if I told you this was not fantasy, but Viking tradition? If this part of history shocked you, imagine what's next. If you're too scared to subscribe, say it in the comments, we'll understand. You were taught to imagine them as warriors. See kings with golden hair and blood-soaked axes, conquering the cold north with strength, steel, and honor. But that was only the surface. A mask. A curated myth built by skalds and sagas, written down centuries after the blood had dried. Because beneath the image of the raider was a very different man, not just a fighter, but a ritualist. A believer. A man ruled by gods who demanded offerings not just of livestock, but of flesh, of shame, of sex, and silence. In Norse cosmology, death was not the end. It was a threshold. And thresholds required blood. The All-Father Odin, the one-eyed wanderer, was not merely a war god. He was a god of sacrifice. He hung himself from the world tree for 9 nights, stabbed with a spear, bleeding wisdom into the void. In his worship, pain was a gift. Death, a transaction. And those who gave most, received most. Then there was Freyja, goddess of love, lust, and war. She rode a chariot pulled by cats, wept tears of red gold, and took half the slain into her hall, rivaling Odin's own. But Freyja's love wasn't gentle. Her domain was erotic power entwined with destruction. The act of sex, when done in her honor, could call forth magic. Could open veils. Could bind a soul to another in life and beyond it. In this world, love and death were never far apart. And so came the rituals. Blot. Sacrifice was the spine of Viking belief. Not symbolic. Not metaphorical. Sacrifices bled. Bellowed. Died. Animals, yes, boars, horses, goats. But at the highest altars, in the deepest woods, and on the bloodiest battlefields, it was women. Chosen. Groomed. Broken. Sometimes slaves. Sometimes captives. Sometimes born into the role. In midwinter, when the sun fled the sky and crops withered in frost, the blood of a young woman was thought to call the gods back from the cold. At funerals, the soul of a dead chieftain could be carried into the afterlife not alone, but on the screams of the girl sent to follow him. Sex and slaughter weren't separate acts. They were one. The eroticism of death. In the Norse mind, the sacred did not mean safe. The gods were not saviors. They were predators cloaked in glory. They watched, judged, and demanded. And their people obeyed. Not just with offerings, but with bodies. Because to refuse meant exile. Dishonor. Or worse, being deemed nothing. Coward. Outcast. Monster. And so the rituals continued. Cloaked in night. Sung over drums. Masked by myth. But strip away the poetry, and what do you see? You see a terrified girl in a locked chamber. You see men too afraid to say no. You see pain carved into religion and normalized through repetition. This wasn't strength. It was submission to something far older, far darker, and far less human. Sex, in Viking tradition, could be sacred. But sacred didn't mean safe. You enjoy discovering truth behind lies? Then join Tale of History. And if you don't, we dare you to explain why in the comments. She had no name in the scrolls. No lineage. No protection. No escape. She was simply the girl. A slave among the Volga Vikings, a people whose rituals were preserved not by their own scribes, but by a stranger, an outsider who had the courage to look, and the stomach to write. Ahmad ibn Fadlan. A 10th-century Arab diplomat sent by the Abbasid Caliphate, whose pen captured the single most detailed and disturbing eyewitness account of a Viking funeral the world has ever known. It began with death. A chieftain had died. A war leader, wealthy, powerful, feared. But for the Norse, death wasn't a quiet affair. It was a gateway. And gateways demanded blood. First, his ship was pulled ashore. His body laid in a temporary grave while preparations were made. Wood was cut. Ale brewed. Offerings gathered. And then, they asked, who among his slaves will die with him? The girl stepped forward. Some say she volunteered. But what does that mean when every eye is on you, when your silence marks you as disloyal? She said yes. Maybe she thought it would be quick. Maybe she thought it would be noble. It was neither. For 10 days, she was isolated. Caged like a spirit being cleansed for sacrifice. She drank heavily, forced, not festive. Mead. Fermented fruit. Mushrooms, maybe. The accounts suggest a fog was drawn over her mind, softening what was to come. And when the day arrived, she was led to the ship. The dead man's boat, his chariot to the afterlife, had been transformed. Blankets and pillows lined the wooden hull. Weapons were placed beside him. Dogs were killed and laid at his feet. Horses, too, slaughtered and arranged with precision. And then came the girl. One by one, the men approached her. Ibn Fadlan wrote it in the cold language of report, but between the lines is a howl. She was led into tents. Multiple men entered. They claimed it was a marriage rite. A joining. But the truth is clearer than that. Her body was passed hand to hand, each act a symbolic knot tying her to the chieftain in the realm beyond. A final man entered, described as the angel of death. But she was no winged figure. She was a priestess. An old woman, feared and revered, who wore a veil and carried a curved blade. The girl was brought out into the open. She tried to climb aboard the ship, but her limbs failed. They had to lift her. She was drunk. Not from celebration. From sedation. And then, 4 men grabbed her. They laid her beside the corpse. She turned her face to the sky. She screamed once. The priestess drove the blade into her ribs, deep and merciless. Some accounts say she plunged it again into her heart. The girl twitched. Then went still. And all around her, the tribe sang. The ship was lit. The flames rose high. The smoke carried the soul of the chieftain, along with the girls, to the afterlife. But the horror doesn't end in the pages of Ibn Fadlan. Archaeological digs in Oseberg, Norway, uncovered 2 women buried together, one younger, one older, surrounded by lavish grave goods and sacrificed animals. The elder bore signs of disease. The younger, signs of trauma. Some believe it echoes the ritual. A sacred killing masked as a royal burial. In Birka, Sweden, another grave, a woman buried with weapons, horses, and wealth, but also near the remains of another, mutilated. Sacrifice, again. Not myth. Not saga. Bones don't lie. This wasn't a one-off story. It was a pattern. Rituals repeated across the Norse world, dressed in myth, fueled by belief, silenced by time. And for every one we've uncovered, how many more burned with no witness? With no name left behind. The world needs to remember her. You can forget and scroll, or hit subscribe and keep her voice alive. They called it training. A rite of passage. A sacred path carved through blood, bone, and silence. The boy, barely 12, was taken from his mother's side and placed under the guardianship of a seasoned warrior. Not his father. Not his kin. A man chosen by the tribe. A man who had tasted war, who bore the scars, and who, it was said, could shape a boy into something greater. Something worthy. But shaping, in this world, did not mean teaching. It meant breaking. Among the Norse, to be a man was not a matter of time. It was a matter of endurance. To prove worth to the gods, to join the ranks of the shield-bearers, a boy had to suffer. His pain was the offering. His submission, the clay from which strength was molded. What began as mentorship sometimes twisted into domination. There are whispers, buried deep in the sagas, uncomfortable fragments no one speaks of directly. The Havamal, a poem attributed to Odin himself, speaks in riddles about power, secrecy, and shame. One stanza warns of the man who gives unwise counsel to the young and receives something in return, something unspoken. The Lokasena, a brutal flighting of insults between gods, includes barbs about Odin's unnatural practices. Loki mocks him for spending time with witches, for dressing as a woman, for learning woman's magic. But beneath the ridicule, there is something else. An accusation. A suggestion that the All-Father, in his hunger for power, crossed sacred lines. And his followers may have done the same. Among Odin's cults, warrior bands sworn to ecstasy, fury, and death, initiation may have included more than fasting and pain. Young boys brought into the fold were not merely taught to kill. They were stripped of innocence, filled with vision-inducing herbs, blooded in ritual hunts, and possibly used. Because in a world where gods demanded everything, what was a child's body but another gift? There are accounts, rare, hushed, of youths who returned from their so-called training silent, hollow-eyed, changed in ways no warrior's scars could explain. The pain they bore wasn't only from blade or frost. It was deeper. It was internal. It was carried for life. And always, it was called preparation. Was it warrior training, or something much darker? The Norse myths never tell you plainly. They hide their truths in metaphor, in verse, in stories meant to entertain and terrify. But the signs are there, scratched into vellum, whispered through the spaces between words. They tell of mentors who took what wasn't given. Of gods who blurred the lines between honor and exploitation. Of boys who were carved into warriors not with swords, but with silence. This is the part of history that rarely survives the retelling. Because it is too uncomfortable. Too stained. Too close. But silence is a kind of death. And forgetting is worse. Most people never hear this part of history. But you just did. Will you do nothing, or hit subscribe and make sure others learn too? It was not enough to fight. It was not enough to kill. Among the Norse, you had to be seen as a man. And being a man, had rules. Not written in ink, but carved in shame. Etched in public whispers and quiet accusations that could spread through a village like rot. There was a word for it, N. And another, urgi. They weren't just insults. They were death sentences. To be called Ningur was to be stripped of your humanity. It meant unmanly. Dishonorable. Deviant. Sometimes coward. Often more. Urgi carried a sharper edge. It accused a man of passivity during sex, of allowing what no man, in their world, was supposed to allow. To take the passive role was to lose dominance, to lose self. And in a warrior culture built on dominance, nothing was more dangerous. You could steal a man's cattle and make amends. But accuse him of urgi, and the only path forward was blood. The sagas are littered with duels that started not over land or gold, but over words. A whispered slur. A sly suggestion. A public insult delivered just loudly enough. There were no courts for such crimes, only blades. A man insulted in this way had two choices, challenge, or crumble. To accept the accusation was social death. You would be shunned, spat upon, denied shelter, mocked in skaldic verses. In some regions, it meant exile. In others, a quiet killing by night. And it wasn't only about sex. The Viking Age had strict expectations of masculinity, expectations enforced not just through honor, but terror. A man caught wearing women's clothes, especially during ritual, could be accused of siege. The feminine magic Odin himself was mocked for. Cross-dressing wasn't merely odd, it was seen as an echo of the unholy, a blurring of divine and deviant. Those who did it were seen as sliding down the slope from manhood into something else. Something unclean. But it was the bottom shaming that carried the sharpest edge. Because in Viking society, to be dominated sexually as a man was to be conquered. And conquest, in their eyes, was a language of the battlefield. To be conquered without swords was the deepest humiliation. It rewrote your place in the social order. You were no longer feared. You were no longer equal. And once that stain marked you, it didn't wash away. Even gods weren't spared. Loki, the trickster, was accused of bearing children, of seducing stallions, of shape-shifting into female forms and suffering the consequences. Odin, too, though the All-Father, was jeered for practicing siege, magic learned from women. His followers would justify it. His enemies would not. And so, men performed masculinity not just with words or weapons, but with postures. Voices. Eyes that didn't blink too long. Hands that didn't tremble. Laughter that didn't rise too high. Because to falter, even once, was to risk the whisper. To risk N. Shame wasn't just emotional. It was fatal. This wasn't strength. It was fear, dressed in fur and bone. It was insecurity weaponized through law and custom. It was a society that feared what it could not control, and crushed it before it could speak. These laws may be gone. But their ghosts remain. You can't say you love history if you only want the clean parts. Subscribe to Tale of History, or explain why you're running in the comments. The battlefield was not the only place where Viking dominance was asserted. Sometimes, peace was made with a smile, thinly veiled, blood still drying on the edges. But beneath the smiles were bruises. And behind the treaties, were beds. Marriage, in the Norse world, was not always a union of love. Often, it was a transaction. A settlement. A spiritual ritual masked as diplomacy. And the cost of peace was almost always paid by a woman. They called it bride-taking. A softened term. A clever one. But what it meant, plainly, was conquest. When two rival clans agreed to end a feud, the winning side often demanded more than gold or land. They wanted a woman. A daughter. A sister. A niece. Given over as a bride. But this was no ordinary wedding. It was a symbolic offering, a living vessel passed from one bloodline to another to seal the peace. And she had no say. Sometimes the bride had never met the man she was to lie with. Sometimes he had been her enemy days before. Sometimes the village still smoldered behind her as the drums of union began. But the songs still played. The rituals continued. Because sex, in the Norse tradition, was not merely an act, it was a force. A magic. In the cults of Freyr and Freya, the twin deities of fertility and desire, ritual coupling was believed to bring forth good harvests, healthy children, and the favor of the land. At midsummer festivals, young women and men were chosen to reenact divine unions in public fields, among fire and ale, under watching eyes. Some went willingly. Others did not. Freya, though a goddess of love, was no patron of gentleness. She was fierce. She wept for her missing husband. She bargained her body for treasure. Her myths are soaked in beauty and blood. Her cult demanded passion, and passion, to them, was often taken, not given. And so, in the villages, the sacred became an excuse. A man could claim divine right. A woman could be told her body was a vessel for the god's will. Resistance meant blasphemy. Submission meant honor. Even in the stories we're told as myth, the pattern repeats. Skadi, the giantess, chooses her husband from the gods. But is tricked into selecting by feet alone. She is mocked, bargained over, discarded. And for mortal women, the fates were harsher still. Entire clans were bound by the forced mating of women. The children born from these unions became symbols, half of one bloodline, half of another. Breathing treaties. Living proof that a woman's womb could do what swords could not. But peace, like war, leaves wounds. What is left for the girl given away as property? For the woman whose body was used as a bridge? What language does she speak when her silence is praised, her pain ignored, her duty exalted as sacred? Even peace began with trauma. And the echoes of these rites, buried beneath saga and soil, still whisper from the past. They tell us that brutality doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it sings. Sometimes, it wears flowers in its hair and walks to the altar without chains, but not without loss. Most remember the battles. Few remember the brides. Few remember what was done to make the swords go quiet. You're not most people. You're still here. So make it count. Subscribe to Tale of History and carry their memory forward. Because peace shouldn't have been bought with their bodies. And forgetting them, would only repeat the violence in silence. They burned their ships. They buried their dead in mounds. They vanished into dust and legend, their swords rusting beneath centuries of soil. But not everything about the Vikings stayed buried. Their myths became bedtime stories. Their violence became folklore. Their rituals, once soaked in blood and silence, were repackaged, softened, sold as tales of adventure. But history has a strange echo. It never disappears. It just adapts. Ask yourself, what do we call it now, when a girl is told her suffering is sacred? When her silence is demanded in the name of honor, tradition, or belief? What do we call it when pain is turned into ceremony? When shame is institutional, inherited, or passed down like heirlooms? If these acts were once called holy, what names do we give to the rituals we hide today? What violence do we still justify? Behind uniforms. Behind oaths. Behind family names and religious symbols. Behind the curtain of culture, of custom, of it's always been this way. The Vikings didn't invent cruelty. They just ritualized it. But their echoes remain in the way we treat bodies like bargaining chips. In the way we dress coercion as ceremony. In the way we refuse to look at what's uncomfortable, until it's too late. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it. In the silence of the girl passed between clans. In the boy shamed into quiet obedience. In the hands that tremble behind the mask of tradition. These aren't just stories. They are warnings. Because when we forget the truth, the lie takes its place. And when we call darkness sacred, we make it eternal. You've made it to the end. Not many do. And maybe now you understand why. Because this isn't about Vikings. It's about us. The Vikings are dead. But the pain they caused, that still walks the earth. If you believe these stories matter, really matter, then do more than watch. Subscribe to Tale of History. If not, tell us in the comments. Tell us why silence is easier than memory. Tell us why some stories are just too hard to carry. And we'll be here. Still telling them. Until someone listens. You were never supposed to hear this. Not the girl's muffled cries in the ship's belly. Not the boy's silence after training. Not the laws that turned shame into death. Not the weddings that bled under garlands and drums. History was supposed to forget. Not by accident, but by design. Sagas chose their heroes. Skalds chose their verses. The victors chose which rituals became legend, and which were left in shadow. But shadows leave stains. And stains, no matter how deep you bury them, rise back to the surface. You've followed every step through the fire. You've stood where no one dared speak. You've looked directly into the rituals others call holy, and seen them for what they are: control, violence, fear. But also something else. A map. A way to trace how far we've come, or how far we haven't. Because behind every ancient rite there is a question clawing through time: when do we stop calling pain tradition? When do we call it what it is? Here, at Tale of History, we don't flinch. We don't clean up the past to make it more comfortable. We drag it into the light, screaming, wounded, and real. We dig up the bones history tried to bury. And we name them. Not as heroes. Not as villains. But as people. If you've made it this far, you've proven you can handle the truth. Not the truth in textbooks. Not the truth dressed up in crowns and sagas. The truth that bleeds. The truth that hides. The truth that matters. Subscribe. And if not, don't be shy. Tell us in the comments why you won't. We read them all. Even the ones that try to forget.